late 50s and early 60s. When I got out of the service, coming back from overseas, I decided that I was going to take a look at what my opportunities might be in civilian life. I enlisted in the Marine Corps in Eureka, California, so I obviously returned to my hometown. And as I drove by King Salmon, which is 3 miles south of Eureka, the city of Eureka, I noticed there's a big construction job going on towards the bay. And so I checked into what that was all about and building a nuclear power plant. And I thought, well, maybe that's something I might be interested in. And so my first job was pulling green chain in Georgia Pacific. And that was from 5 at night till 2 in the morning, 5 nights a week. And I figured that was not the kind of job I wanted to end up with. And so I went to the PG&E office and filled out an application and expressed an interest in getting a job. But the gal that was working the front desk said, well, we don't have any openings right now. And I said, well, can I go ahead and take and fill out the application and take the pre-employment test that you give? And she said, well, okay. And she handed me the application and I filled it out. And then I said, well, how about the pre-employment test? And about that time, the personnel manager walked in, and she said to him, well, he's asking to apply for a position that we don't have. We don't have any openings. And now he filled out the application. Now he wants to take the pre-employment test. And to my surprise, the personnel manager said, well, why not? Come on into it. And I went into his office and I took the pre-employment test, which involved a dexterity test. And so I won't go into the details there. But I scored the highest score that they had ever received in the pre-employment test. And so he picked up the phone and called the service center and said, I know we don't have any openings, but can you create something because we don't want to let this guy go that I've got in my office. So long story short, I started at the very bottom of the food chain for PG&E as a laborer, picking up cigarette butts and garbage and whatnot around the service center, but rapidly moved into a groundman, senior line truck driver, apprentice lineman, and ended up in Garberville. And then while I was down there, I was able to bid into the Humboldt Bay power plant as a apprentice instrument repairman. And I said, well, yeah, that's where that nuclear facility is now online. And so that would be a wonderful opportunity for me to get in there, even though as an apprentice instrument repairman in units 1 and 2, long story short, I got in there, and within 6 months, I was promoted into the apprentice nuclear control technician program. And then it was the longest apprenticeship program that PG&E had, and eventually I became a nuclear control tech. And when I entered that field, I truly believed that I had achieved a dream career opportunity of a lifetime, getting in on the ground floor, because I believed going into it that nuclear power was the panacea for emerging energy crises. And so that's kind of the backstory, and this is where I'll take off. I don't know if this thing works. I guess I have to reach down here. Anyway, I ended up writing a book, and it's back there in the back, about my experiences, and I'm going to talk about those experiences to share with you what life was like and how I moved from being pro-nuclear to totally anti-nuclear. And I arrived at that conclusion as from personal experience, professional experience inside a nuclear power plant. Humboldt Bay was a small reactor, 53 kilowatts. It had AEC operating license number 7. PG&E was the sole operator. It was the first privately funded nuclear power plant in the world. All the ones preceding it was financed by government and all that sort of thing. The Humboldt Bay power plant was totally financed by PG&E. And PG&E management was bound and determined to make that plant successful. What happened, however, is that they loaded the initial core of the reactor with stainless steel fuel cladding. And stainless steel was cheaper than the alternative that they could have chosen, because that was zircaloy cladding that had been developed by the United States Navy to use in their nuclear vessels in the late 50s and on into the early 60s. And so the cladding broke down and caused Humboldt Bay to end up becoming the dirtiest nuclear power plant in the nation. And PG&E covered that up to the extent that PG&E was able to do that. I'm going to give you an example of the first problem that reared its ugly head. They wrote RWPs, routine work permits, or radiation work permits, but we call them routine work permits, to distinguish them from special work permits. And they wrote RWPs for the collection and analysis of reactor water samples. And the RWP specified an exposure rate of 5 MR per hour. And when I showed up at the plant went online for the first time in August of 1963, and I showed up in March of 1964. So the plant hadn't been operating all that long. And as an apprentice instrument repairman, I had plenty of opportunity to find my way over to the nuclear unit. That's kind of where I wanted to end up. And I picked everybody's brains, and I studied the instrument manuals and their rad protection manuals and all of that stuff. And that's one of the reasons why I, within 6 months of being in the plant, I ended up in the nuclear unit and the apprenticeship program. And so the dose rate levels on the reactor water samples, and I'm going to focus on that for a minute, was 5 MR per hour. We would go down to minus 14 alongside the reactor and collect reactor water samples at the collection site. We had two plastic 1 liter bottles, put them in a wire basket, and carried them up to plus 27 and the radiochemistry lab to do the analysis on the reactor water. And we had to do that every single day. And over time, because the plant was becoming progressively more radioactive in terms of the contamination levels everywhere, those rate levels on the reactor water samples went from 5 MR to 50 MR to 100 MR to 500 MR, and they continued to climb all the way to over 3,000 MR per hour. And so, still as an apprentice nuclear control tech, I started complaining about the problem. Because when we went down to minus 14 at the collection site, we had to stand right in front of the sample station and hold the plastic, 1 liter plastic bottle up and valve the valve to get the reactor water to fill up that 1 liter bottle. And then we capped it and put it in the wire basket, and then we did another one and put that in the wire basket. The sample station itself went clear up to 11,000 MR per hour. It was because it started collecting reactor crud in the plumbing. And so my constant complaining about that, which started in 66, the latter part of 1966, I went to the chemical engineer, which was one of my supervisors, first line supervisors, and then I went to the radiation protection engineer. They were very unhappy with me, and then I ended up talking to the plant nuclear engineer. And they said, you know, something needs to be done about the problem. We need to put a biological shielding up in front of the sample station so that employees are protected while they're at the station collecting the samples from those high radiation dose rates. And I said, secondly, we need to have extension tools so we can take the sample bottle and put it over by the piping where we got the reactor water out of, and then we needed another tool to turn the valve so that we put some space between us and the sample station. They absolutely refused to do that. And I got myself in a lot of trouble. We had the same problem with collecting off-gas samples. The off-gas samples was taking a sample of the radioactive gaseous waste discharge out of the 250-foot stack. And we had certain tests that we had to do on those samples as well, and we had the same problem. The dose rates were going through the roof. And so I couldn't get management to respond. I created a lot of trouble for myself because I was being very persistent in this. And so what I ended up doing is I went to the December 12, 1967 safety meeting. I've been complaining for over a year about the problem. So I stood up very publicly and I quite honestly criticized company management, plant management. They were all right there in the room along with all the employees. There were about 75 of us in the assembly building. And I demanded that something be done. And the reason why I went to the safety meeting is because they had to take minutes of what took place at the meeting. And I assumed at that time, I was very naive, that the AEC would review the minutes. Because I had asked to talk to the AEC compliance inspectors who came into the plant, and as a refused permission to talk to them. They wouldn't let me talk to them. And so anyway, I did that at the December 12, 1967 safety meeting. That was in the morning. The meeting ended shortly before lunch. We all went to lunch. And then right after lunch, everyone who could leave their workstations was called into the conference room in the admin building of the power plant and raked over the coals for what the discussion that I caused to take place. And we were told never to use the company safety meetings in that way again. Never. And so, you know, we walked out of there. But I got called back to the front office about 3 o'clock that afternoon, maybe 3:30, by the plant nuclear engineer, Edgar Weeks. I don't mind mentioning his name. And he threatened me. He said, you know, I'm tired of your constant complaining. You're supposed to promote harmony, not disrupt it. You're supposed to promote company policy. And it's not your job to criticize plant management or the decisions made by PG&E's corporate offices, which is right over here on 245 Market Street. And he said, you know, Bob, if you're looking for trouble, you're going to find it. And well, sure enough, I didn't back off, and I ultimately found trouble. And I'll share that with you in just a little bit. And but you know what that caused to happen? They put up a biological shield over the next like 2-3 months in front of the sample station, reactor water sample station. They ended up with lead pigs for the 1-liter plastic bottles to go into so that we could carry those up to the radiochemistry lab at plus 27. They gave us a stainless steel extension tools to hold the bottle up and then to valve the thing, so at least it was an improvement. But I paid dearly plant management was very unhappy with it. They beefed up the off-gas sampling station. They redid the plumbing on it, the valving, and put lead stuff over the stuff that we had to get up to collect those samples and whatnot. And so there was an improvement done there, and on the off-gas sampling as well. Okay, I'm jumping around a little bit, but examples of the kinds of things that caused me to lock horns with PG&E management. One day I was doing a C area survey, C standing for clean, very clever, C area, clean area survey. It went out into units 1 and 2, which was the fossil fuel units, that had the cold machine shop and cold instrument shop and the warehouse and so forth. And just to kind of walk around with a GM radiation detector and to see if anything had gotten out of the radiation controlled area by mistake. And oftentimes that was a boring job, but the big day came when I was walking through the cold machine shop and I had my headphones on and I could hear the sporadic counting, clicking sound, just background background radiation, which was low level. I'm walking along and all of a sudden it's saturated. And I looked and it was a piece of pipe laying on the end of the long workbench in the cold machine shop. That was about 14 inches in diameter and about 22 inches long. Heavy cast iron pipe. And it was radioactively contaminated. I looked around in the machine shop and I didn't see anybody, but I heard somebody behind the welding curtain at the far end. So I taped it off real quick, ran down there to see who was back there, and it was a welder, and I said, "You know anything about that piece of pipe that's on the workbench?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I put it there." I said, "Well, where'd you get it? It's radioactively contaminated. Do you know that?" He said, "No, I didn't know that." I said, "But I got it out there at the scrap metal bin. There's a whole bunch more pieces just like it out there." And so I said, "You've got to be kidding me." So I ran out to the scrap metal bin, and it was huge. In fact, there were two bins side by side. They were empty. There was nothing in them. And so I ran back and I said, "When did you get that pipe out of there?" He said, "Well, a couple of days ago." I said, "What are you doing with it?" "I'm going to make something out of it." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I ran into the maintenance foreman who's responsible at the time for disposing of scrap metal and waste and emptying the empty dumpster and all that kind of stuff. And I said, "The scrap metal bins are empty." He said, "Yeah, GNR scrap metal from Eureka came and picked it up, picked all the stuff up." I said, "You've got to be kidding me." I said, "Did you call him?" He said, "No, the front office did." And I said, "Really?" So I talked to the welder and I said, "Did you see an unconditional release tag on that piece of pipe that you pulled out or any of the other pieces of pipe?" He said, "No." So I went to the maintenance foreman. I said, "Did you see an unconditional release tag? If so, who removed it?" He said, "No, I didn't see it." I said, "Did you see any paperwork?" "No, I saw no paperwork on that." And I said, "Aren't you the one that's responsible for disposing of the scrap metal and the waste and so forth and so on, calling the garbage company in to pick up the empty dumpster and dumping it into the truck?" He said, "Well, yeah, but not this time. It's done by the front office." So I then said to the radiation protection engineer, and I don't mind mentioning his name, Jerome Boots, Jerry Boots, and I said, "We need to send a radiological monitoring team down to GNR scrap metal and locate all that pipe and bring it back to the plant and properly survey it out. And if there's a problem with it, we keep it, dispose of it properly. If it's clean, let it go back." But my reasoning was that one piece of pipe was contaminated, the other pieces were probably contaminated too, because what I found out that these were sections of suppression chamber pipe that came out of the containment system. And the only way they could get it out, it was put in there when the plant was built. So these two sections of pipe had to come out, they had to cut it into sections. So if one of those pieces of the pipe was contaminated, the others could have been contaminated more so or maybe less, it's hard to say. But about 40 pieces total, 35 or 40 pieces. And so the odds are if the one piece is contaminated, there's got to be more of those pieces also contaminated. Well, make a long story short, what happened was, I went to every other nuclear control tech. There were 7 of us in the plant. And I asked them, I said, "Who surveyed that stuff out? Because that was our job." And they all said, "I don't know." "Nobody remembers doing it?" No, they didn't remember doing it. So what happened was that stuff disappeared out of the control area of the plant, the radiation control area, in the middle of the night, under the cover of darkness, to the scrap metal bin. And then the front office called GNR scrap metal to come and pick it up and haul it off to downtown to put a G Street in Eureka, because that was the cheapest way to dispose of that stuff. Otherwise, it would have been a monumental task of taking all that heavy cast iron and sending it to if it was all low level, to the eastern, there was a disposal site in eastern Washington. And we'll talk about that business in just a minute. And so I had the opportunity to subpoena documents and subpoena witnesses at an unemployment hearing. Unemployment because I got fired. So PG&E said, nah, we're not going to pay him unemployment benefits. Or he doesn't qualify because he was fired with cause. Oh, so I appealed that decision. Normally, those kinds of appeals last for 30 minutes to an hour and a half before a referee of the California Unemployment Appeals Board. Mine lasted for 2 full days, with the second one following the first one 6 weeks later, because the referee needed to come up to speed on some of the issues that were brought up during the first hearing. And so I was able to put the nuclear engineer and the rad protection engineer under oath. And I put the questions to them, and they answered. I said, where's the paperwork? Did you ever see the paperwork? No. Nuclear engineer. I said, well, don't you think that a nuclear control technician, if he was asked by his one of his supervisors to go out to the archived record and search for a certain something or another, a certain document that nuclear radiation, what am I trying to say, control technician would know how to do that? And he said, well, sure, yeah. I said, well, I went out there and I looked for those records after I talked to you after following the incident, and I couldn't find them. You went out there on your own without being asked to do that? Well, that's the kind of stuff that always gets you in trouble. And so the bottom line is those records didn't exist. They couldn't produce them because no one ever filled them out. They just got rid of the stuff in the cheapest way possible. A very inappropriate way as well. And so another example was Raymond Skidmore and I were the 2 control technicians that pulled duty on the rad protection duty on the 6th of August 1969. And I'll never forget the date. I mean, I came into work and I knew that the spent fuel shipping cask was down there in the refueling building alongside the spent fuel pool, and the decon area had been loaded up with spent fuel and sealed underwater in the spent fuel pool. And then it was hosed down as it was coming out of the spent fuel because the spent fuel pool was grossly contaminated and put in a decon area. And they worked around the clock 24/7 for several days to get that cask into compliance with DOT regulations. And so on the 6th, when I showed up, I learned that Raymond Skidmore was going to be my partner in crime to get that cask released from the plant. And so we went down with the radiation protection engineer, Gail Allen, and there's a Frisker probe that they're supposed to run over the bodies. Most of the employees never did that. And I looked at the digital readout and I said, oh, your right shoe is contaminated big time, because it saturated those tubes underneath both feet on the right side. I said, step off there, give me your shoe. He gave me his right shoe. And I took it in to the lab and I put it on a piece of acetate. And I took a GM to it and it saturated the GM. I want you to understand what I'm telling you here. I took a GM and held it up against the sole of the shoe and it just saturated. So then I took a cutie pie, we call them CPs, that's a dose rate instrument, and I put it on the sole of the shoe and it reflected at like 2 to 3 R. I said, my word, man, your shoe is really crapped up. And I looked at it, and I had surgical gloves on, and I put goggles on because it could be high energy beta. And there was a beta window on the CP, but before I even got to all that, I said, this is awful. And so what happened was, I took a roll of masking tape, and I pulled it out and put the sticky side out, back on the tape, and I rolled it with a lot of pressure over the sole of the shoe, and the shoe came clean. whatever I had was now on the masking tape. So I gave the employee his shoe, and I said, okay, you're free to go, because it was quitting time. And then I took that masking tape, strip about like so, and I started cutting it down, clean, hot, until I got it down to the size of about a postage stamp. And whatever was causing the problem was on that little piece of masking tape, about the size of a postage stamp. And I looked under, there was a 300 magnifying glass, and with a neon light or fluorescent light treatment. It must be that black speck right there. Well, the 2 to 3 R that the CP was reading wasn't an accurate reading because it was a pinpoint source. And CPs in those days couldn't accurately read a pinpoint source. It was really, really hot. And so I called the radiation protection engineer, you know, the guy that had the degree in air conditioning. And he comes up and I says, Gail, we've got a problem. I shared the whole story with him. And I said, and you know that employee had not even been, hadn't been in the radiation control area today. He was out and about in units 1 and 2 and outside doing whatever he was doing. But he walked into unit 3, control room. You can't get into the radiation control area without, you have to go through access control to get into that. So he was in the control room for some reason. But he didn't go across the step-off pad. And Gail said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, no, I'm not kidding you at all. And so what happened was, I said, okay, Gail, I went to the access control log. That employee was telling the truth. He did not go across the step-off pad. So what did that mean? He picked that up outside the radiation control area. And the significance of this, besides the obvious, is that it was the first of many more particles to fall. And every one of them had to come get on shoes and pant trousers and sometimes in the sleeves, had to come from outside the radiation control area, because when you go inside the radiation control area, you put on protective garb. And you take off all your street clothes, except for your skivvies, your socks, and your shoes. You put rubber galosses on over your shoes, and then booties over them. Surgical gloves, surgical cap, and all that, when you go into the radiation control area. So these guys were picking those things up. And then I tell you, when I complained to the AEC about this and a whole bunch of other things, the AEC said, well, we never found any records of that. And I said, well, there had to be, because I told you that PG&E replaced all the trousers and all the shoes that were contaminated. And there has to be a paper trail, because there's, you know, the accounting system. And I said, did you see it? No, I never saw it. And so that it goes on and on and on, that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't have time, but how was I retaliated against? I'll just finish it on this. After I was fired, I was taking classes at Humboldt Bay, and a fellow classmate, one of my classes, said, Bob, I've got something I've got to show you. And I knew he worked for the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. He worked night shift, and something came across his desk. It was a police report. And he showed it to me, and I swear to God, the blood just rained out of my face. I read that thing. The police report was calling me a communist that involved in a plot to blow up the power plant, a subversive, advocated firebombing and violence, and the list goes on from there. And it's all in my book. I've copied the report, it's one of the appendices in the book and so forth. And so I was never supposed to see that. And it turns out that there were 7 nuclear control technicians, and 4 of us were named in that. I was the leader. But it was the 4 who were very unhappy with PG&E policy and the way they went about doing their business. And so long story short, I filed for a copy of it. It took 2 years to get it, but I did get it. And the reason why I got it is because they initially argued that it was a privileged document, law enforcement document, and law enforcement has to be able to keep records like that for law enforcement purposes, except that when I saw it, and the guy let me read it as many times as I wanted, and he burned it up in a metal trash can that we were at on campus, I sat down from memory and I wrote out everything I could remember about that report. It was 2 pages, single space, ugly stuff. Second page, at the bottom, CC, FBI, also CC to PG&E, to 2 agents of PG&E. Well, PG&E is a private, it's like a private citizen, it's a corporation, not a government agency. And so I finally, we have more time, but I finally went to my attorney when we were suing for the documents. And said, why don't you tell the judge to order the city, who was trying to keep me from getting a copy of it, and PG&E and the city were working together, order the judge could order the city to give him a copy of it. He could take it in the camera, which means it goes into the chambers, his own chambers, and he can read it, and on the second page, if it was disclosed to PG&E like I said it was, then that waiver of privilege had been, the waiver had been waived. It gives it to one private party, then you've got to give it to somebody else. And the judge came out, and he was, I remember it, Judge Watson, he had a red face, he was angry, his veins were sticking out in his neck. And he looked at the city attorney, he says, you give Mr. Rowen a copy of that, I'm ordering you to do it, and I got it. And it's, like I say, it's in my book. But the purpose of that was to make me a security risk. Because I would never, ever be able to go out again in the nuclear field and get a security clearance in another facility. That was the purpose. And I wasn't supposed to be the wiser. So, I mean, I've got a lot more to say. I'm going to be in San Luis Obispo Monday, Mothers for Peace sponsoring the event. I'm going to be one of the speakers down there. And then I'm going to be interviewed in a private home on Tuesday, on the 21st, I guess it is, or whatever that date. And then I'm going to be back in San Francisco at the Global Exchange Monday night from 6 to 9.
We occupy forum.
Huh?
Occupy forum.
Occupy Forum.
What Monday?
Monday the 27th.
That was the 28th.
Huh? I think it's the 20.
Because we have to do
Maybe it is. It's the first. It's the last Monday of this month, whatever Monday that is.
27th.
And now I won't be hounded. I can do my whole PowerPoint presentation, take you through a whole bunch of stuff for those that can make it, and it's really an eye opener.
For blowing the whistle about health and safety problems, and you would think that the federal government would be concerned about this and want to protect these workers. Well, Darrell Whitman, it was a federal OSHA inspector, lawyer, who did investigations of nuclear whistleblowers. And I actually, the first time I talked to him, he told me that they were not being protected. So welcome, Darrell Whitman.
When Steve first asked me to come several months ago to this conference, I didn't tell him, but I've been involved in nuclear issues since the 1970s, when I was one of the more early members of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I developed a very strong sense of the dangers of nuclear power 40 years ago, and I have been persuaded since that it was a good take on the subject. My own background, just to give you a little idea, I'm an attorney. I hold a PhD in public policy. I have been teaching in England for a number of years. I came back to the United States at not a good time in 2009 during the Great Recession, and for personal reasons, and found it difficult to find a position in universities. So I ended up taking this job with OSHA. And I took the job because it was advertised as a position conducting investigations to protect whistleblowers. And I thought, hey, perfect, this is exactly what I need. It's going to be an interesting job. I get to look at 22 different industries, there's 22 statutes involved. And I was designated the guy that was going to do the investigations for environmental whistleblowers. And that includes whistleblowers in the nuclear industry. So one of my very early cases involved Humboldt Bay. So I can kind of answer the question that Bob doesn't know about what's happened in Humboldt Bay. As it turned out, the whistleblowers I had were the two senior safety officers at Humboldt Bay. And one of them, Zane Easley, had worked with Senator Lieberman in Congress to develop the protocols for decommissioning nuclear plants. Now, this is a subject we haven't talked about in this conference, and we really need to talk about it. What do we do with nuclear plants when we shut them down? They're no longer producing the profits that the utilities want, but at the same time, they're just as dangerous as a decommissioned, well, not decommissioned, as a plant that's no longer functioning as they were as a plant that is functioning. They still have all those component parts. They still have the nuclear fuel rods. They still have the containment buildings, which can be extremely dangerous. And there really hasn't been a good think-through as to what we actually do with these plants. We're now looking at 100 plants at the end of their lifetime. I know there's a lot of talk about somehow extending the lives of these plants. But if you know a nuclear plant and you know why they're at the end of their lifespan, you have to ask some very serious questions about, is that an even realistic alternative? Well, I can tell you at least as far as Songs, the San Onofre plant, and as far as Humboldt Bay is concerned, both Southern California Edison and PG&E are struggling with this issue right now. These are utilities in a for-profit industry. They're not in business to subsidize the public interest, unfortunately. In fact, what I found out in investigating the case at Humboldt Bay was that money that was earmarked for the decommissioning process was actually being diverted by PG&E to other for-profit interests. And this was one of the first issues that this particular officer, this senior officer, brought. He had worked the nuclear industry for 20 years. He was very well known. He was considered the leading expert in the United States on decommissioning. He had come out of the 2000-2001 hearing processes with a specialized knowledge and all this experience. He came out to PG&E believing that this would be his opportunity to participate in the first true shutdown of a nuclear and decommissioning of a nuclear plant. So he walks on the site in 2002, and what does he discover? He discovers, first of all of his security staff, or most of them, are completely incompetent. They're carrying personal weapons. Some of them can't pass a physical exam. This is, after all, Humboldt. And I think most of us have some idea of what happens in Humboldt County. Most of these folks were locals. So one of their side activities was drugs. And he discovers that he has plant managers who are not only dealing drugs at the plant site, but they're actually using them while they're operating the plant. Now, I'm not sure that the public would be real thrilled with the idea of having a stoner running a nuclear plant. But that, in fact, was what was going on. So, of course, this guy's a real straight shooter. You know, he's from Nebraska. He's a church-going guy. He believes in the process. He believes in the rules. And just like Mr. Rowen over here, you know, if it says you're supposed to do X, well, you're supposed to do that. So he starts pushing against PG&E management about some of these issues, the training for the security officers, the fact that they're diverting funds, the fact that, among other things, he discovers they've lost fuel rods. Well, they don't know where they lost them because the accounting process was so poor. They couldn't tell if they just made a mistake on the audit or if indeed somehow they got lost. But this was the state of the conditions at Humboldt that he found when he came in 2002, 2003. So he began to push back. But because of his status in the nuclear industry, I think Humboldt, PG&E was very cautious about what they did with him. They tried to basically persuade him to see their point of view, that it was inconvenient, it was costly, and we're going to do the right thing one day. Just be patient with us. Well, that didn't prove to be the case. So he goes through about 5 years of this. He trains his subordinate, Mr. Sanders, in the same standards that he believes in. So you have the top security official and the man just below him. Both of them are going to enforce the rules. And what happens is they started reporting to the NRC. Now, Mr. Easley was well known to the NRC. They had dealt with him for more than 20 years. He knew a lot of the senior folks. So in 2009, they're going to have an audit. They announced, I always thought this was kind of curious. The NRC gives everybody, you know, like 3-4 months notice. We're going to come and check you out and see if you're doing the right thing. This is actually very common in most industries, I discovered. There's no such thing as a walk-on, you know, unannounced inspection. You want to be sure these companies know that you're coming so they can do things to make sure that you don't find problems when you get there. So the NRC gave the company advance notice, and the company decided, we have 2 guys here that, you know, they're just not playing ball. And they keep reporting stuff to the NRC, like, oh, you know, we've got drug dealing going on at the nuclear plant. So the NRC, they demoted Mr. Easley and promoted his subordinate, believing, oh, his subordinate's a local guy, he's one of us. He will understand our local culture. Wrong. He started doing the same thing. So here comes the NRC. They're going to do an audit in January of 2009, and they come out, they say, first thing they said was, where's Zane? You know, we understood it's on the record that he's the safety guy that we're supposed to be dealing with. Where's Zane? So Mr. Sanders tells him the story that they, you know, switched the places, and Mr. Easley is kind of in the doghouse on the other side. If you want to talk to him, you have to do that on the side. That he's the front guy. But Mr. Sanders follows the rules. He tells them everything. He shows them where the deficiencies in the construction for the safety devices are going wrong. He tells them about the drugs. He tells them about the whole thing that Zane was telling them for several years. At the end of the audit, I don't know if he realized he was going to do this, but the senior auditor, you know, they gather everybody, the plant managers together, to give them kind of an oral report on the audit. The first thing he does is he praises Mr. Sanders for his transparency and for being forthcoming about the problems at the plant. Within 48 hours, Mr. Sanders was fired. Within that same period of time, so was Mr. Easley. I was interested in what Mr. Rowen said, because that wasn't where the story stopped. Mr. Easley was well known. He had lots of friends in the nuclear industry. So there's a group, Neta Corporation, which actually does very high-level placements in the nuclear industry. And he knew the guy who ran the company, so he calls him up and he says, hey, you know, I've got this problem out here. You know, I was trying to report these problems, and I got myself fired. Well, of course, the first thing the PG&E does is they accuse them of violations that will put his license in jeopardy. So he can't be rehired in the nuclear industry. So what Neta does, because they know Mr. Easley, they conduct their own investigation. And they find that there's no credibility to the reports that PG&E makes. So Neta arranges for Mr. Easley to find another job in the nuclear industry. What happens next? PG&E retaliates against Neta, cancels all their contracts, bars them from coming out to PG&E. So we now have retaliation against the whistleblower, against the whistleblower's subordinate, against the company that does an investigation that discredits PG&E. I mean, this is a very arrogant company. You know, when you think about the power of this company, and I think all of us who follow the press now know the corruption with the PUC, between the PUC and PG&E, there is a complete disdain for the law and for the public interest here. And yet, we still don't have any serious effort to reform PG&E. Personally, I don't think it can be reformed. I agree with Steve. We need to make it a real, true public utility and get rid of these people that are operating it only for personal profit and for personal interest. But the reason I I like this conference, I'm really glad I came, I learned so many things. And you know, that's the big struggle. We just don't know what's going on most of the time. I had another investigation with an employee down at Songs. And what I discovered was what the nuclear industry is doing now that they're reaching the point where there's lots of issues, health and safety issues, they're hiring outside contractors to come in and manage the plants, to deal with it, with the maintenance issues and to deal with the decommissioning issues. Why? Why are they using these outside contractors? It's a great way of creating space between the utility and the work. It's also the fact that these outside contractors, almost all of them are non-union. So the employees don't have a tradition of solidarity. They don't have a structure that they can go to and say, hey, you know, I see cracked pipes here. And let me tell you, there's a lot of cracked pipes in nuclear plants these days. I see problems with maintenance. And then when they get retaliated against, you know, they can go to their union. Well, they're not there. And for most of them, the other problem is these workers are not educated about the dangers of the places in which they're working. The young man I dealt with in the Songs investigation told me one day, I said, well, you know, how much radiation are you exposed to? I don't know. How much am I supposed to be exposed to? Well, I don't know. Didn't they tell you? Well, they gave me a badge. You know, I go on into the plant every day and I take the badge and I give them the badge at the end of the day and they write it on a chart. Well, what does the chart say? I don't know. You know, what does it mean? I don't know. So here's a young man, probably in his late 20s, a family, and he has no idea the risks that he is taking in taking this job. And I suspect that he's not alone. You know, we get reports, we did when I was working there anyway, we would get reports about the situation up at Washington. What's that? Hanford. You know, there's some really nasty things going on at Hanford. With contractors, with employees, it's a really bad business. But somehow we can't seem to find the will as a country, as a government, to protect the public interest. Well, I watched this from inside. When I did my investigation of PG&E, and it was absolutely clear, this man suffered retaliation, serious retaliation. He was entitled to be protected as a whistleblower. Did OSHA do that? No. What happened was, as soon as I started to come to the point of having the evidence and making the report that this man needed protection, we needed to report to the NRC that we had a genuine whistleblower, because that would have forced the NRC then to step in and actually investigate the issues that Mr. Easley and Mr. Sanders were raising. That's one of the functions that OSHA plays, this program plays, is to be sort of an intermediary. We do the investigation, we find a case that shows a probability of a violation. We report that to the industry, to the regulatory body, the NRC, the EPA, the FAA. They're supposed to then come in and investigate the underlying issues. If we never find that these people are whistleblowers, we, being OSHA, never make that report. There's never an investigation that goes on. And what I found after 5 years was it's pretty rare for OSHA to find people or whistleblowers. Less than 3% of the cases.
So these guys weren't found whistleblowers?
Correct. When I came forward with my proposal, with my preliminary investigation, said, hey, I've got not one, I've got not two, I've got 3 investigations here that have come to the same conclusions. I've interviewed 9 people, employers, the managers, and I have virtually smoking guns here. Well, as soon as I did that, I was attacked by my manager. Well, PG&E didn't like that, so they called up and screamed at my supervisor that I was making trouble for them. So that turned into an attack on me. And that happened not once or twice or 3 or 4 times. It happened in virtually every case I had involving a major corporate player. OSHA will go after the small guys. If you're just, mom and pop operation down here, you have 50 employees or less, you'll feel the full weight of OSHA and its program. But if you're a major corporation, like PG&E, and you have dozens, sometimes hundreds of lawyers, and you have the political clout to make life uncomfortable for the senior managers and supervisors of the agency, hey, you're safe. OSHA will not take any action. So I think that the take-home lesson here is it's for the American public to stand up and demand that we have real protection for the whistleblowers. They are the only ones who are going to tell you what's actually going on. Just like Mr. Rowen. Your supervisors are not likely to do that. People from the outside won't see the day-to-day operations and understand the risks that are involved. We need to protect these people, and it's not happening, and it needs to happen. So I thank you again for coming. I think it's been a really useful thing for me. I just wanted to add one small thing. I live part-time in the Ukraine, and I was thinking about Chernobyl the other day, and I was talking to some friends in Ukraine about Chernobyl, and I said, what do you know about Chernobyl? Now this is 2015, and that was an accident almost 30 years ago. I asked these folks, I said, every school child in Ukraine knows the story. And they told me the story in detail. They teach their children about the dangers of nuclear power because they had this horrific incident that left over 2,000 square miles of Ukraine, north of Kiev, in a protected zone, an exclusion zone. And they know what that means. And they know that they still don't know what its effect was on the Ukrainian people themselves. And that's a key. We have to teach people. They have to know these stories. They have to know the risks. And I believe if people really do know the risks, we would shut down every single nuclear plant in the world. Because there's absolutely no good reason to have these plants except that they produce short-term profits for companies that build the plants and short-term profits for the companies that run them. And then we're left with the mess at the end. Thank you.
Are there any questions for? Okay, you have a couple of questions. Yeah.
Darrell, that was really interesting. I love it.
Can you come up here, Darrell?
Yes.
Is it possible to read copies of the reports you wrote? Are they online?
Well, I'll tell you, what I have discovered, I'm now being protected, fortunately, as a whistleblower myself now, by the Government Accountability Project in Washington. And it's a great program. I strongly recommend it. Daniel Ellsberg is part of that program. And they're trying to bring accountability to government, which is no small task at all. They have a great leader in Tom Devine. I have given them the documents. I just finished a report to the Office of Special Counsel that runs about 175 pages and includes about 360 or 70 documents. Some of those documents are reports that I wrote, but guess what happens? When I wrote those reports, the supervisors went in and changed them so that it would appear that it was it justified dismissing these cases. They falsified government documents, in effect, so that they could protect themselves and protect the agency from criticism from the corporations. Now, I have those. I'm sure the agency is not happy that I have them. They may not know that I have them.
You had the originals.
Well, yes, I have the originals. I have the electronic originals. I kept electronic files. It was my habit when I did my policy work to work with electronic files. Oddly enough, it wasn't until I came along that the agency itself actually started using electronic files. But when I saw the pattern and I saw how high up it went in OSHA and how high up it went in the Department of Labor to the very top, I knew that I had to keep those copies. So I have those copies, yes.
I'd be especially interested in the Humboldt one, if that's
Yeah.
possible.
The thing easily, yep, easily Sanders, sure. I've given some interviews to NBC News, and I've told them, you know, when I came as a public employee, I take that term public very seriously. You know, it's you, the American public, that's paying my salary. You're the folks that are paying for the operation of the program. It's supposed to be a program to serve the public purpose. And there are a very few small group of cases where you can honestly say privacy rights trump public rights. But those are small cases. The agency wants to use those to protect everything it does. So I don't believe that's true. I think that the reports I've written, the documents I have are public documents, and I have shared them with NBC, I've shared them with Bloomberg, I've shared them with the Government Accountability Project, and they will come out. Yes, sir.
Do you perceive any differences with OSHA in their conduct with any of this under David Michaels?
Well, I'll tell you, when I came in right at the moment that Dr. Michaels was making one of his periodic speeches. He's a complete disaster as a manager. He says all the right things. This seems to be the pattern in government. You know, we have spin doctors, and you hire, you know, you appoint people as secretaries or, you know, agency heads who are good at making speeches, and they're very sensitive to the constituencies that got them the appointment.
You elect them to.
Pardon? No, you didn't elect them.
Same thing with people that you elect.
But you know, I think personally, when I look at this, I have to ask myself, how did these people get appointed? What's the vetting process that lets a president and his advisors make such appointments? Because we've had, in OSHA and in the Department of Labor, we've had some really disastrous appointments, both coming out of the Bush administration, but also with the Obama administration. Not good. Not good at all. And I know I was told by Mr. Devine, who met with Dr. Michaels, he says, you know, he sat there and whined about nobody appreciates what he's done. Well, the bottom line is he's there to exercise leadership. If that leadership isn't there, he's not doing his job. I don't care what his speeches sound like. Right now, this agency is populated with people who are very pro-industry. I've listened to them in meetings talk about, oh, you know, that's insubordination. You know, what we really want is we want people who follow orders, whether they're in government or out of government. So it's a very pro-authoritarian kind of mentality. There is a complete disregard for the law and the rules. I mean, we actually have some pretty good laws here. And if you actually looked at the whistleblower statutes and the regulations, they read beautifully. I mean, you would think, oh my God, we've got this wonderful program, we're going to protect whistleblowers. Wrong. You have to get down to the level of who makes the decisions, how the program actually functions. And if these people are intent on frustrating the program, and Mr. Devine and I agree on this point, they are intent on frustrating this program. They're very pro-industry. Just like the NRC has become a captive agency, OSHA has become a captive agency of the major corporations. The little guys, hey, they'll run for the woods. But the big corporations, they're in their pocket, and they know it. And I can hear that when I have to talk to the attorneys for these corporations. They know that they've got them in the pocket. Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever inspected Diablo Canyon?
No. What we do is we respond to complaints from individual employees. So I had an employee from Songs, from Southern California Edison, San Onofre, and I had one from PG&E, from Humboldt. The reality is the nuclear industry is a very chilled workplace. Very chilled. I had a hard time, both at Songs and at Humboldt, getting interviews with employees. They're scared to death. Particularly if you go to a place like Humboldt, this is a relatively poor area. These are good jobs. You know, and you look around, what are these people going to do if they lose their job at PG&E? You know, there's the timber industry, you can go fishing, very dangerous, hard work. You can only do it up to a certain point in your life. So they hold on to these jobs. It's that financial insecurity that binds them to the management and blinds them often to their own self-interest, which is very sad. Yes, yes, sir.
This is another case that's too big to fail.
Well, again, I think Steve and I agree on this. We don't need to fail them. We need to make them work. And if that means that we operate them as a public entity, so be it.
Just a quick little question, because I didn't follow it. Mr. Sanders and Mr. Easley
Yes.
were part of Humboldt, but
They-
I thought they shut them down. or they-
No. I didn't finish the story. Humboldt, PG&E's plans for Humboldt are to turn it into a nuclear repository, a waste dump, basically.
Oh,
And, and some of the things I heard would make your hair stand on end. One of the things that happened shortly after I started my investigation was the PG&E had decided that they were going to take the containment building down, right? Well, PG&E has a sweetheart arrangement with Humboldt County. They agreed early on to hire locals as often as they could. That's how it got populated with a lot of pretty incompetent people. But the other thing is they contract out, and it's interesting, again, what Mr. Rowen said, they contract out with local construction people, et cetera. So the plant, they announced this plan, they're gonna take down the containment building. Now, for you folks who know about containment buildings, this is a very, very tricky operation. And the plant sits 3-4 miles from Eureka. It sits about 8 or 9 miles as a crow flies, from Humboldt State University. It's actually a pretty densely populated little area. This contractor, talking to some folks that still worked in the plant at the time, they were appalled because the contractor was just gonna send some guys in there with jackhammers to take the plant down. It was just a, concrete building, concrete and steel. They had done that before, not a nuclear plant. So I think that did not last, unfortunately. But you can imagine, the containment building, the first 6 feet on the inside, heavily contaminated. Not to mention all the piping and all the equipment and all the other things around the plant. And as Mr. Rowen pointed out, things outside the plant. There's a lot of contamination. This is a very, very challenging process.
is there any action in Humboldt or Eureka? Any groups? Does the
Well,
community understand this?
No, the community
It's like
does.
the workers in the plant.
PG&E is really good at its public relations. A little money to the local radio station and local TV station. And it's like, well, let's celebrate PG&E. They're one of the major employers. They're an important player in that neighborhood. So they get a lot of positive press. I know there's a public radio station in the area, and they do a fairly good job, but nobody's really telling them. And that's the problem we have. People just don't know. If they had the physicians for social responsibility actually tell them, most people tell them what the risks are, we would have a really different environment, political environment to work in. But people are not told, and it's very hard to get to people and explain these issues to them. It takes attention, it takes time, it takes a sophistication in communications.
For every political effort, on every level, it's the same thing.
Yes. Except nuclear power is power. It's enormous amounts of power. You've got a confluence of financial interests, corporate interests, political interests that come around this issue, and they're all in bed together protecting it. And that's a really tough nut to crack.
Last question.
Did I hear you correctly that their goal presently is to turn Humboldt into a waste or something?
Yes.
Thank you.
What, medical waste?
Well, I think they'll take any waste that they can make money from.
But that's like, how close is that to Pacific
Oh, it's right there. It's right there.
Directly served.
It's not gonna happen in their lifetime. He believes this. You know, if bad things happen, it's not gonna happen in my lifetime.
But they've actually said this publicly, we're gonna turn it into.
I believe that it's known in the area. I certainly heard that from a lot of people that I talked to, including Mr. Easley, who sat in on the highest levels of management of PG&E up until he was fired in 2010. That was the plan. That's why he was brought in to be the officer in charge of decommissioning, so they could convert the plant into a storage facility.
And these are the people, when I was at the Quran, I broke a story
Yeah.
about how they lost a nuclear fuel rod.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
And they
right,
never
right.
found it.
Right,
And
right,
To
well-
this day, they don't know where it is. And
They don't
these are
know-
the people
oh, they
who
don't.
now wanna-
They don't, no. Well, and worse, you know, as Zane pointed out to me, I went up and visited. I like to do site visits. I like to know what I'm dealing with. So he kind of walked me around the area, not in the plant, obviously. But he pointed out there's a very popular trail that's not far from the plant. A lot of people like to go, you know, out for a jog or out for a walk, and it's a beautiful area to do that when the weather's good. And so we go down this path. He says, you know what's over there about 100 yards? That's one of the dry fuel facilities, 100 yards. 100 yards. Do people know that? Is there any sign? No. No, so every day people are going by completely oblivious to the reality of the risks. Pardon?
Guards or anything to make sure that,
No.
I mean, that'd be a juicy target for ISIS.
You know, you really, we do this job, and, you know, I did this job for 5 years, and I learned, among other things, that the railroads, you know, leave the trains running while the crews go off for lunch. Leave the keys in the ignition, literally, you know, and they've got LPG tanks, and they've got all sorts of things sitting on a track. The train is running, they gotta go to lunch, sorry. It's too much work to turn it on, turn it off, so we'll just leave it running.
Two-man crews, one-person crew.
Right. So, I mean, you know, this is the mentality. You know, this whole business about security, I really, you know, after I look at this stuff, and some of the cases I handled were appalling. I mean, as bad as the PG&E and actually Songs wasn't as bad, but as bad as these cases are, I've had worse cases involving much more serious risks to the public that got the same treatment. So I have to really raise some questions. Is this just a ruse? You know, we keep people distracted, worry about the ISIS in the Middle East, when you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans at risk from preventable accidents. How many people die on the highways because the trucks aren't properly maintained, and you've got truckers driving over hours, and by the way, they're carrying munitions through your neighborhood? You know? It's all about appearances.